6 years of exile shattered by a child's plea. Please, mighty human. My mother was taken by enemies. Tobias, marked by his father's brutal legacy, faces an impossible choice: remain hidden or confront the violent past he tried to escape. The desert world of Aridin 6 holds no mercy, but this girl's desperation might just rewrite his destiny. The cave was cut into the red rock face, a tight space with a single narrow opening. Tobias kept his bow strung and his sword within reach. He woke with the twin suns and slept when the cold set in. Water came from a hidden seep in the back wall, food from the thin-legged creatures that scuttled across the dunes. He had dried meat, a clay pot for boiling, a roll of salvage cloth for repairs. It was a life built on lack. A spiral of scar tissue marked his forearm, 3 jagged lines radiating from the center. He earned that brand at 14, pressed into his skin with a heated iron rod. It meant loyalty. It meant he was Warlord Darius's first son, heir to the Iron Nomads. He wore it like a chain. He remembered the raid on the Lacostran outpost, the smoke, the cries. His father pointed to a young boy no more than 6. "Prove your loyalty," Darius said. "Show them your strength." The child's eyes were wide, uncomprehending. Tobias shook his head. He dropped his knife. Another warrior did the deed without a word. Tobias did not stop him. The boy fell. That moment lived inside him, a cold stone in his gut. His exile was the price for his silence. The shelter held 1 bedroll, 1 cup, 1 plate. He had fashioned a lock for the entryway from scrap metal and wire. It was built to keep the world out. It was built for one. For 6 years, the only sounds were the wind scraping sand against stone and the distant calls of night stalkers. Solitude was his sentence. Hope was a risk he couldn't afford. Then a new sound, small, faint. It cut through the wind's drone. A voice. He stilled, his hand going to his sword. He listened. It called again, closer this time. Not a threat. A child's voice. It was thin, scratched raw by the dry air. It was calling for help. The plea settled in the quiet of his cave. It wasn't just a sound. It was a key, turning in a lock he thought was sealed forever. It spoke of a mother taken, of enemies, of a need for a strength he had abandoned. He looked at the brand on his arm. It was a mark of violence, of a legacy built on fear. But the voice did not sound afraid of him. It sounded afraid for someone else. The desert wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and something else, the sharp, clean smell of approaching rain. It also carried the echo of that small, determined voice. It was the first new thing he had allowed into his life in 6 years. It was the start of a choice he never thought he'd have to make again. He stood in the mouth of the cave, looking out at the endless red sands, and for the first time, he felt the walls of his exile begin to crack. She stood half in shadow at the cave mouth, a small figure against the endless stretch of desert. Dust caked her cheeks and the fine sleeves of her tunic. Her eyes were 2 dark pools of fear, but she did not look away from him. She was a lustroin child, probably 8 or 9. Her skin held the faint pearlescent sheen of her people, now dulled by travel and grit. She had found a place he had spent years making unfindable. "My mother was taken by enemies," she said. Her voice was thin but clear, each word a deliberate effort. It was not a lament. It was a report. Help save her. The request hung in the dry air. It was a stark, impossible demand. It was the blade that finally pierced the silence of his exile. He asked her name. She gave it without hesitation. Eleliana. He asked who sent her, how she knew to come to this forsaken rock. Elder Morath, she answered. The name landed like a stone in his gut. It meant the network of Lacostran sentinels still lived. It meant his presence, his failure, was still marked on some secret map he thought had faded to dust. She had walked for days on the Elder's word alone. She spoke of her mother, Serena, a healer, taken during a nomad raid 3 sun cycles past. They moved the captives north toward the pass. The details were precise, a child's clear-eyed recounting of a nightmare. Tobias knew the route. He knew the men. They were not just enemies. They were the warriors he had trained with, shared water with, called brothers under his father's banner. He told her it was a long way. He told her the desert did not forgive mistakes. He made her no promises. His voice was flat, a commander assessing a doomed mission. The odds were a cliff face with no handholds. To get her mother back, they would have to intercept a hardened nomad convoy. He would likely have to fight, to kill. The faces of men he once knew flashed behind his eyes. Their deaths would be on his hands a second time. She listened. She didn't argue or beg. Her trust was a physical weight in the space between them, heavy and absolute. She believed Elder Morath. She believed the mark on his arm was a sign of strength she needed, not the shame he carried. Her need was a simple, unshakable thing. It was a weight his pragmatism could not dismiss. He looked from her determined face to the barren world outside. His shelter was a tomb for a dead man's conscience. This child offered a reason to leave it. Her plea reframed everything. His exile was not a penance. It was a stockpile. 6 years of survival skills honed in isolation were not for hiding. They were for this. For a journey he never wanted to take, toward a past he tried to bury. Her faith was the catalyst. It was a spark in the dust. It asked a question his solitude had never posed. Could a weapon be used to guard instead of conquer? He looked at his hands, at the bow and the sword. He looked at the small girl waiting for his answer. The silence stretched, but it was a different silence now. It was filled with the hum of a choice being made. He did not say yes. His refusal was quiet, practical. He told her it was too far, too dangerous. The words were a shield. Behind them stood a memory, solid and cold as stone. He made her sit. He poured her a measure of water from his clay jar. Her small hands cupped the cup carefully. She watched him, waiting. He started with the raids. He described the dust clouds on the horizon, the ordered lines of mounted warriors, the systematic search for anything of value. People were part of that value. He did not soften the details. He told her about his father's methods, how Darius used fear like a tool, precise and brutal. He spoke in a flat, even tone. It was a report, a history lesson from the wrong side. Then he told her about the boy, a child even younger than she was. They had taken a small outpost, a cluster of tents by a dry riverbed. The fighting was over, his father pointed. The order was simple. Prove your loyalty. Prove you are my son, kill him. Tobias remembered the sun glinting off the knife his father offered. He remembered the boy's face, confused, not yet afraid. He shook his head. He said no. He dropped the knife in the dust. The refusal felt like a victory for a single heartbeat. Then another warrior stepped forward. A man named Kale. He did not hesitate. He picked up the blade. He did what Tobias would not. The act was swift, clean, final. The boy fell without a sound. Tobias stood there. He did nothing. He watched the life leave the child's eyes and did not move a muscle. His refusal had been a formality. The outcome was the same. His inaction was its own kind of violence. That guilt was a ghost that never left his side. It walked with him into the desert. It lived in this cave. He told her that story was why he lived here. Alone. His skills were for survival. He knew how to track, to hunt, to kill. But he had seen what those skills built. A legacy of fear. A trail of bodies. He was not a hero. He was a man defined by a failure 6 years cold. The brand on his arm felt heavy. It was a reminder of a chain he broke, but the weight of it remained. Eleliana listened. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She absorbed the story, her gaze steady on his face. Her silence was more powerful than any argument. She did not see the monster he described. She did not see the warlord's son or the man who let a child die. She looked at him and saw something else entirely. She saw the man who had said no. She saw the man who had walked away. Her quiet hope was a quiet judgment. It measured his guilt and found it wanting. It measured his isolation and found it pointless. She finished her water and set the cup down with a soft click. She did not ask again. She simply waited, her small form patient in the dim light of the cave. His refusal began to crack. It did not shatter from force or argument. It eroded under the constant, gentle pressure of her faith. She had not come for a warrior. She had come for him, the man who refused. The understanding in her eyes was a key, turning slowly in a rusted lock. He looked at his hands. They were the same hands that had dropped the knife. Maybe they could be used to pick one up for a different reason. The wall around his resolve grew thin. A faint light showed through the cracks. Tobias led her out into the cool air. The twin suns were gone. The sky was a vast black sheet pricked with silver stars. The heat of the day had bled away, replaced by a dry cold that crept through clothing. They moved in near total darkness, their path lit only by the starlight reflecting off pale rock. Their destination was the lake basin, a 2-day trek northwest. The terrain was a maze of wind-scoured stone and sudden drops. Tobias moved with a deliberate economy. Each footstep was measured, placed with care to avoid loose shale. His bow was in his left hand, an arrow nocked but not drawn. His head turned in a slow, constant scan, checking the high points, listening to the night. The air was still. Too still. This was nomad patrolled land. The lack of sound felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. Every shadow could hold a scout. Every rock formation could be an ambush point he himself had used years ago. Eleliana stayed close behind him, a small, silent shape. She did not complain about the cold or the pace. She matched his steps, her smaller legs working double time to keep up. Her breathing was a soft, steady rhythm beside his. He glanced back once. Her face was set, determined. She was a child on a mission, her fear held tightly in check. They were an unlikely pair, a tall, scarred human exile and a small, pearlescent-skinned alien girl. A weapon and a plea walking together into the dark. The ground began to change. The bare rock gave way to patches of dry, rust-colored moss. A few stubborn, thorny shrubs clawed at their legs. They were nearing the basin's outer reaches, where underground water allowed sparse life to cling on. The vegetation was a sign of hope. It was also a sign of increased danger, more cover for predators, more reason for nomad patrols to sweep the area. Tobias stopped, holding up a closed fist. Eleliana froze instantly. He stood perfectly still, listening. The desert night was not silent. It had its own language of tiny clicks and rustles. He was filtering them, separating the normal from the threat. Then he heard it. A skittering sound like claws on stone. It came from their left, from a jumble of large boulders. It was too heavy for a scuttler. Too deliberate. A low growl rumbled through the cold air. It was a deep guttural sound that vibrated in the chest. It did not come from one place. It seemed to come from the darkness itself. Tobias slowly turned, putting himself between Eleliana and the source of the noise. His bow came up. He scanned the rock line, his eyes straining to pick out a shape in the deep black. Another skitter closer this time. Then another growl answered from the right. They were being flanked. The first test of their fragile alliance had arrived. It was not a nomad patrol. It was not a human enemy. The threat was native, ancient, and hungry. The shadow stalkers were here. Two sets of green eyes ignited in the dark. They floated low to the ground, unblinking. A third pair appeared, then a fourth. Sleek shapes detached themselves from the deeper shadows of the boulders. They moved with a liquid grace, muscles coiling under dark, matted fur. They were shadow stalkers, each the size of a large dog, built for silent pursuit. Their low growls formed a rough chorus that tightened the air. Tobias raised his bow. The draw was a smooth, practiced motion. His body knew this response. Identify the threat. Neutralize it. The closest stalker took a testing step forward, lips peeling back from long, sharp teeth. This was the language Tobias understood. Force against force. He sighted down the arrow shaft, aiming for the beast's shoulder. His finger tightened on the string. Eleliana moved. She did not step back. She stepped in front of him, placing her small body between his bow and the advancing creatures. He started to pull her behind him, a sharp command forming on his lips. Then she began to hum. It was not a song he knew. The melody was strange, made of low, resonant tones that seemed to vibrate in the chest rather than the ear. The notes hung in the cold air, clear and deliberate. They did not sound like a child's voice. They sounded old. The humming shifted, becoming a series of soft clicks and rising, falling pitches. It was a pattern, a ritual. The lead stalker stopped, its head tilted. The aggressive hunch of its shoulders relaxed. The glowing green eyes narrowed, not in threat, but in what looked like recognition. The growling ceased. The other creatures slowed their advance, circling with a new, curious uncertainty. Their tense, predatory focus softened into a kind of watchful waiting. Tobias held his draw, the bowstring biting into his fingers. He watched the stalkers. He watched the girl. The standoff stretched for a long moment, balanced on the edge of those strange humming notes. Slowly, he eased the tension on the string and lowered the bow. The arrow remained nocked. Eleliana finished the sequence. The last tone faded into the night. She turned her head slightly toward him, her voice a quiet murmur. It is the song of passing. My people learned it long ago. From them. She did not take her eyes off the creatures. The tones say we are just travelers. We mean no harm. We are just moving through their territory. We are not prey. We are not a threat. The largest stalker let out a soft chuffing sound. It turned and paced back toward the rocks. The others followed, melting into the darkness as silently as they had arrived. The glowing eyes winked out one by one. The immediate danger was gone. The only sound was the whisper of the wind over stone. Tobias looked down at Eleliana. The bow felt suddenly heavy and crude in his hand. His first instinct, his only instinct for years, had been to meet a threat with a sharper threat. He had seen the stalkers as a problem to be solved with violence. She had seen them as beings with their own rules, their own language. She had not fought them. She had spoken to them. She had used knowledge where he would have used an arrow. His assessment of her shifted. She was not just a child to be protected. She was not a burden slowing him down. She carried a different kind of strength. She understood this world in a way he never could. She was a bridge between his harsh, practical survival and the deeper, older rhythms of Eridan. The silence that returned was not the silence of threat. It was the silence of peace, hard-won and unexpected. He slid the arrow back into its quiver. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the way forward was not through a fight, but through understanding. The jagged line of mountains cut across the northern horizon. Two great slabs of rock had been forced together by some ancient upheaval, leaving a sharp, narrow gap. The pass of winds. Even from this distance, the sound of it reached them, a constant low howl as air was forced through the tight stone corridor. It was a natural bottleneck, a place where a large force became a slow, vulnerable line. Tobias scanned the terrain below with a soldier's eye, calculating angles of approach, fields of fire, lines of retreat. The ground fell away into a wide, dusty plain, and on it movement a convoy, a long line of dark, slow-moving shapes. He counted the mounted scouts first, 4 outriders keeping a wide perimeter. Then the main body, maybe 20 riders, their postures relaxed, confident. Behind them, the reason for this whole desperate trek. 3 enclosed wagons, their wheels kicking up plumes of red dust. Prisoner transports. He knew the design. Reinforced wood, a single barred window in the back, a locked door. 60 warriors at least. A full raiding party returning home with their prize. The sight was a cold fist in his gut. It was a scale of force meant to discourage exactly what he was considering. Eleliana saw it too. Her small hand gripped his arm. "My mother," she whispered. The words were not a reminder. They were a gut punch of pure urgency. Every rotation of those wagon wheels took Serena farther away. Every moment they spent watching was a moment lost. Her need was a palpable force, a desperate hope that clashed violently with his cold assessment of the odds. Her world was measured in the painful distance to her mother. His was measured in the number of enemy blades between them. He looked from her strained face back to the convoy. An ambush was their only real option. A direct assault was suicide. But an ambush here with just 1 bow and 1 sword against 60? It was a gamble with the worst possible odds. He ran through the variables. The narrowest point of the pass was a kilometer ahead. The convoy would be stretched thin there, forced into a single file. The high ground on either side offered cover. It was a good kill zone. It was also a trap they might not escape. One mistake, and they would be the ones caught inside it. He made his decision. They would parallel the convoy's route, staying high on the ridgeline, keeping out of sight. They would move faster than the heavy wagons. They would reach the ambush point first. He laid it out for her in short, clear sentences. The plan, the risk, the absolute necessity of her role. He crouched down, his face level with hers. His voice was low, serious. "You must promise me," he said. "When the fighting starts, you stay hidden. You do not come out. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, you stay safe. That is the only way this works." She nodded. Her small face was pale but set. "I promise." She agreed, but the fear in her eyes was a mirror. He recognized it. It was the same fear he had carried since the Lacostran outpost. The fear of watching someone you need die while you stand helpless. It was the fear of loss. Her trust in him was total, and the weight of it was immense. The plan was set. It was a fragile thing, built on the thin strands of his fading skills and her unwavering need. It was a wish made of smoke and hope. They turned from the view of the slow-moving convoy and began to move along the ridge, their pace quick and quiet. The passive winds howled ahead of them, a natural amplifier for the chaos to come. It was no longer just a geographical feature. It had become a stage. It would host a rescue or it would host their deaths. There was no middle ground. The light changed. It wasn't a slow sunset fade. The sky deepened from violet to a bruised purple. Then the larger of the two moons began to rise. It was wrong. It wasn't its usual pale silver. It was the color of old blood, a deep solid red that stained the night. The crimson light washed over the desert, turning the sand black and the rock the color of dried gore. The air felt thick, charged. It hummed with a low, subaudible frequency that set the teeth on edge. The world felt different under that light. Older, wilder. Aleliana stopped walking. She looked up at the red disk, her face solemn. "The blood moon calls them home," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the new, heavy silence of the night. She didn't look at him. She didn't say who them was. The statement hung there, a simple fact that explained nothing and everything. It was a piece of her world, a piece of the deep cultural knowledge he would never fully grasp. The ground shuddered. It was a deep, grinding vibration that came up through the soles of his boots. A sharp crack split the air, the sound of solid rock giving way. The earth in front of them bulged upward. Stone and dry soil erupted outward. Something huge forced its way up from the depths. Dust and debris rained down around them. It was a deep walker, a thing of myth made real under the red moon. It was massive, a towering insectoid form that blotted out the stars. Its body was a series of segmented plates, an exoskeleton that glowed with a sick, unnatural blue light. The light pulsed faintly like a slow, cold heartbeat. It had too many legs, jointed and sharp, digging into the broken earth for purchase. A set of complex, multifaceted eyes caught the red light, reflecting it in 1,000 bloody pinpricks. It clawed at the air with two huge, serrated forelimbs, a gesture that was pure ancient predator. The sound it made was a dry, rasping hiss that vibrated in the chest. It was a nightmare given form. Tobias moved on instinct. He shoved Aleliana behind him and drew his sword in the same motion. The blade felt small and useless against the sheer scale of the thing. He set his feet, ready for an attack that would likely end him. He expected a charge. He expected those claws to scythe through the air and cut him apart. The beast shifted its weight. The blue glow intensified for a moment. Its head turned. Those multifaceted eyes seemed to look right through him. It hesitated. It did not advance. It simply stood there, a monument of living nightmare, silhouetted against the red moon. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to sink back into the broken ground. The earth swallowed it whole, the fissure closing over its glowing carapace until only disturbed soil remained. The deep tremors ceased. The only light was the eerie red glow from above. The encounter had lasted less than a minute. It left a silence that was louder than any noise. Tobias slowly lowered his sword. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked from the patch of torn earth to Aleliana. She was watching the spot where the creature vanished, her expression unreadable. She had known. Not the specifics, but the context. She understood the rules of this world under the red moon. The event was a stark reminder. Their struggle was not just a human conflict of nomads and captives. It was set against a backdrop of forces far older and more powerful. A single misstep, a lack of knowledge, could bring a death that had nothing to do with swords or arrows. His survival, their survival, now depended on more than his combat skills. It depended on her, on the songs and the stories and the warnings passed down through her people. He was the weapon, she was the guide, and this world demanded both. The howl started as a single note far out on the plain, a long, high cry that sliced through the red-lit silence. It was answered at once from the east, then the west. A full pack closing in. They came into view a moment later, running low and fast. Their coats were the color of dried blood, perfect camouflage under the stained sky. They moved with a liquid grace, their muscles bunching and stretching under sleek fur. Their eyes burned with a faint orange light. They were not just hunting. They were riding a wave of pure lunar frenzy. Tobias grabbed Aleliana's hand. "Run." They broke into a sprint, heading for a jagged line of rock that thrust up from the plain. It was the only cover. The wolves saw the movement and adjusted their course, cutting an angle to intercept. The gap closed with terrifying speed. Their paws made almost no sound on the hard-packed earth. The only noise was their panting breaths and the pounding of his own heart in his ears. He pushed his legs harder, pulling Aleliana along. The rock was still 50 meters away. It felt like a kilometer. A sharp cry cut the air. Aleliana's hand was wrenched from his. She went down hard, her foot twisting on a loose stone. She crumpled into the dust with a gasp of pain. Tobias skidded to a stop and turned. The lead wolf was 20 paces back, its lips peeled away from long yellow teeth. There was no time to think. He dropped his bow. It was a liability now. He bent, hooked his right arm under Eleliana's legs and scooped her up in one motion. She was a light weight against his side. His left hand drew his sword. He ran for the rocks. The first wolf leaped. He didn't turn to look. He felt the heat of its body, heard the snap of its jaws a hand's breadth from his back. He reached the base of the outcrop. It was a sheer face of rough, weathered stone about 4 meters high. There were cracks, small ledges, just enough for handholds. He sheathed his sword. He needed both hands. He shifted Eleliana's weight, clamping her tight against his right side with his arm. She locked her own arms around his neck, holding on. He began to climb. It was a brutal one-handed ascent. His left hand scrabbled for purchase, his fingers digging into cracks, pulling his body upward. His right arm burned with the strain of holding her. His boot slipped on the smooth stone. Below, the wolves gathered. He heard the scratch of claws as one jumped and scrambled partway up the rock face before falling back. Their frustrated snarls filled the air. He didn't look down. He focused on the next handhold, the next inch gained. His muscles screamed in protest. His breath came in ragged, tearing gasps. He heaved himself over the top, rolling onto the flat summit of the rock. Eleliana tumbled from his grip, landing softly beside him. He lay on his back for a second, his chest heaving, his arms trembling with exhaustion. The howling from below was a constant, furious sound. He pushed himself up onto his elbows and looked over the edge. The pack circled the base of the rock. There were 6 of them. Their red coats gleamed in the bloody light. They moved with a deadly, restless energy, their orange eyes fixed on the summit. They were beautiful in their lethal perfection, a natural force of teeth and speed and hunger. They were also terrible. A perfect engine of death, frustrated for the moment but patient. Eleliana sat up, cradling her ankle. She looked down at the circling wolves, her face calm. "They are not evil," she said softly. Her voice was quiet but clear over the snarls. "The moon makes them hungry. It paints them red. They are just being what they are." She didn't sound afraid. She sounded observant, almost respectful. She saw the raw, terrifying beauty in the danger below. She humanized the monsters by acknowledging their simple, driven nature. It was a perspective born of a lifetime on this world, a way of seeing he was only beginning to understand. The climb had been a trial of pure physical sacrifice. He had carried her weight, risked a fatal fall, pushed his body to its limit to protect her. That act, that raw expenditure of effort for another person, changed something between them. It was no longer just a guided mission. It was a bond forged in strain and survival. They were safe for now, on an island of rock in a sea of predators. The immediate threat was contained, but the night was long and the blood moon was still high. The cave was a narrow fissure in the mountain's face, a crack that promised shelter from the red moon's unnatural glare. Inside, the air was still and cool. The first thing he saw was the fire, a small, smokeless pile of glowing embers. The second was the body. An iron nomad lay sprawled near the back wall, his armor stripped, his throat cut. A neat professional kill. The sigil on his gear had been scored through with a knife. He was unmarked, a rogue. Tobias's hand went to his sword hilt. His eyes scanned the dark corners of the cave. The silence felt heavy, watchful. A voice came from the shadows to his right. It was low, cold, and horribly familiar. "Fancy meeting you here, Tobias." A figure stepped into the faint, flickering light of the embers. Lyra, his half-sister. Time had not been kind. A thick scar ran from her hairline down across her cheek, pulling the corner of her mouth into a permanent, bitter smirk. Her left eye was gone, the socket covered by a worn leather patch. Her right eye was the same hard gray as his, as their father's. She looked him over, her gaze lingering on the bow in his hand, the girl standing close behind him. Her good eye dropped to his forearm, to the branded spiral. "Still wearing the mark, I see." Their shared history was a battlefield of its own. Rivalry, violence, a constant struggle for their father's twisted approval. They had trained together, fought together, hated each other with the deep, specific passion only siblings can muster. They were bound by blood and a mutual desire to see the other fail. She had always been the more ruthless, the more pragmatic. The scar on her face was a testament to that. The dead man on the floor was likely another. He wondered which of them had given her the eye. She gestured with her chin toward the cave entrance, toward the distant convoy. "I've been picking off scouts for days," she said. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, but there are too many for one person to take on directly. She knew the caravan's composition, its route, its weaknesses. She knew their father's tactics because they were her tactics too. She had been planning her own strike. A solo war against the machine that made them. She saw the calculation in his eyes. She saw the distrust. "They have something I want," she stated. It wasn't a request for help. It was an assessment of mutual need. A map to the old colony weapon caches. "You want the healer. I want the map. We want the same convoy stopped. Our methods align. For now." It was the coldest, most practical alliance imaginable, forged not in shared hope, but in shared hatred of the man who had forged them both in violence. The mission expanded in that moment. It was no longer a simple, desperate rescue. It was no longer just about one woman in a wagon. Lyra's goal was strategic, destructive. She wanted to find the caches and deny their power to any warlord, including their father. Her involvement pulled the conflict into a wider, darker scope. Tobias looked from his sister's scarred face to Aleliana's hopeful one. He was caught between two worlds, two purposes. The personal and the tactical crashed together in the dim cave. He gave a single, curt nod. The temporary alliance was struck. The ghost from his past was now his partner. The stakes had just gotten much, much higher. Lyra unrolled a worn scrap of hide on the flat rock between them. It was a map of the pass, hand-drawn with sharp, precise lines. She pointed with a calloused finger. "They'll be strung out here in the narrowest section. Scouts move ahead, then the main guard, then the supply and prisoner wagons. The rear guard follows last." Her knowledge was intimate, absolute. She knew their patrol rotations, their signal calls, their preferred formations. She spoke their tactical language because it was her native tongue. They're disciplined, but they're predictable. They use the same routes, the same patterns. Our father taught us that. Consistency is a weakness. She laid out the plan in short, clear sentences. It was a coordinated ambush built on misdirection and terrain. Tobias would take the high ground on the eastern ridge with his bow. His job was to target the lead scouts and the wagon drivers, create immediate chaos at the front of the column. Lyra would work the western side, using the cover of the rocks to get close. She would plant a deadfall trap behind the prisoner wagon, using ropes and counterweights to drop a precariously balanced slab of rock. It would block the retreat route, cutting the convoy in half and trapping the key elements in the kill zone. The goal was swift, brutal efficiency, a surgical strike aimed at the convoy's heart. Her good eye moved to Aleliana, who stood watching from the cave mouth. "The girl stays here, out of sight. She doesn't move until one of us comes for her. She is a liability in a fight. She becomes the priority." The statement was cold, pragmatic. It redefined Aleliana from a reason for the mission to its most vulnerable asset. Her safety was now a primary objective, a fixed point around which their violence would orbit. Protecting her was no longer just an emotional impulse. It was a tactical parameter. Then she stated her price. Her goal was not the healer. It was a map. She believed the convoy's commander carried a detailed chart showing the locations of the old colony weapon caches. These were not just stockpiles of blades and bows. They held energy weapons, explosives, technology from the first human settlers, power that could vaporize a man or level a settlement. That kind of power in their father's hands would cement his rule forever. In anyone's hands, it would shift the balance of the entire region. Her objective was to find that map and use it to locate and destroy every cache one by one. She wanted to deny that power to every warlord, including the one who shared their blood. Tobias looked from the map to his sister's scarred face. Trust was a thin wire stretched over the canyon of their shared history. Every look, every word was measured against years of rivalry and betrayal. He knew her pragmatism could easily become opportunism. Her help came with strings attached to a much larger, much darker conflict. But the math was simple. They needed each other. He gave a single, slow nod. The agreement was silent, built on mutual need, not faith. The plan was set. It was a knife aimed at the convoy's side. But the purpose of the thrust had changed. It was no longer just about pulling one woman from a cage. It was about preventing a greater war. It was about ensuring the tools of mass slaughter remained buried and forgotten. Lyra's involvement transformed a desperate personal quest into a calculated strategic strike. The ambush was no longer an end. It was the first move in a much larger game. The weight of that new responsibility settled on Tobias's shoulders. He looked at Aleliana, who trusted him to save her mother. He looked at Lyra, who trusted him to help her burn a legacy of power to the ground. He was caught between two trusts, both heavy, both dangerous. The cave felt smaller, the air tighter. The Red Moon watched through the entrance, a silent witness to the pact. The silence of the pass broke with a soft thud. The lead scout fell from his saddle, an arrow through his throat. He made no sound. A second scout turned, his mouth opening to call a warning. Another arrow took him in the chest, punching through leather armor. He slumped forward. 200 meters away on the opposite ridge, a third man died just as quietly. Lyra's work. A knife in the dark. The outer perimeter was gone. The convoy advanced unaware. Chaos arrived a moment later. A supply wagon near the front hit a pressure-triggered deadfall. A net of heavy rocks rigged with twisted wire dropped from the cliff face. It smashed into the wagon's team, tangling the animals in a thrashing, panicked knot. The wagon behind it swerved, its wheels lodging in a deep fissure Lyra had disguised with loose scree. The line jerked to a halt. A perfect bottleneck. The narrow canyon walls trapped them. Shouted orders mixed with the screams of injured beasts. The convoy's discipline, once a rigid line, frayed into confusion. Nomad warriors dismounted, drawing swords, forming a defensive ring. Their training held, but it was a reactive move. They were responding to an enemy they could not see. The ambush had the momentum. Tobias knocked another arrow. He sighted on a man trying to cut the deadfall ropes. He loosed, the man fell. Tobias was already moving, climbing higher along the ridge, finding a new firing position. He was a ghost on the rock, a brief flicker of movement between shadows. On the other side, Lyra was a darker shadow flowing between boulders. A nomad checking a wagon latch suddenly gasped and fell, a knife hilt protruding from his back. She vanished again. The heart of the convoy was the third wagon, heavier, reinforced, the prisoner transport. Its door was chained and bolted. Tobias saw Lyra signal from her side. She had planted her main trap. With a sharp crack, a counterweight released. A precariously balanced slab of sandstone, the size of a small hut, dropped from the western wall. It landed directly behind the prisoner wagon with a ground-shaking crash, completely blocking the retreat route. The convoy was now cut in two. The rear guard was sealed off. The key objective was trapped. Two nomads guarding the prisoner wagon exchanged a look. One raised a heavy axe to break the lock. Tobias put an arrow through his shoulder. The man cried out, dropping the axe. The other guard turned, raising his shield. An arrow from Lyra's bow shattered against it. The distraction was enough. Tobias saw a figure inside the wagon move. A hand, slender and determined, reached through the bars. It held a sharp piece of shattered pottery. The hand sawed frantically at the rope binding the latch mechanism from the inside. The rope frayed, snapped. The wagon door swung open. Figures spilled out into the dusty chaos. They were thin, scared, their clothes torn. They blinked in the harsh light, disoriented. They moved with the hesitant steps of people who expected another trap. Then one woman stepped forward. She did not look scared. She looked focused. She immediately knelt beside the wounded guard, her hands moving to his arrow wound, applying pressure with a torn strip of her own sleeve. She spoke calm, low words to the other freed captives, directing them to take cover behind the wagon's wheels. Her hair was matted with dust, but her eyes were clear and steady. This was Serena. Even in captivity, she was a healer. She was tending to the enemy. The sight of her made the fight real. It was no longer an abstract tactical exercise. It was no longer about maps or weapon caches. This was the woman Eleliana had walked across a desert to save. This was the reason for every risk, every kill. The objective was no longer a concept. It was a living person, calm and capable in the middle of a battlefield. The cost of this ambush was written in the bodies on the ground, in the blood staining the sand. But the goal was now in sight, solid and real. The price was rising, but the value of the prize had just been measured in a single selfless act of mercy. A figure broke from the defensive ring of nomads. He moved with a fighter's confidence, his armor marked with the same spiral sigil Tobias bore on his skin. Marcus. He had been a boy when Tobias left, all eager energy and sharp smiles. The boy was gone. The man who replaced him was hard-eyed, his face set in a permanent scowl. He embodied the legacy their father built, a devotion to violence, a loyalty bought with fear, a cruelty worn like a badge of honor. He stopped 10 paces away, his sword held loose and ready. "You're the deserter," Marcus said. He spat the words into the dust between them. "The warlord's son. He told us you were dead. Should have stayed that way." The words were meant to bite, to shame. They were the official story, the lie that sealed his exile. Hearing them from his brother's mouth made them sound true. The duel began without another word. There was no ceremony. Marcus lunged his blade a silver arc in the dusty air. Tobias parried, the impact shuddering up his arm. They knew each other's styles, the patterns drilled into them since childhood in the same training yard. It was a brutal personal dance. Sword rang against sword. Each block, each strike was loaded with their shared history. This was not a fight for territory or loot. It was a settling of accounts, a brother killing a brother. Marcus was faster, fueled by a pure, uncomplicated hate. He pressed the attack, forcing Tobias back toward the rock wall. His moves were aggressive, predictable. He fought like their father taught them: overwhelm, dominate, break. Tobias fought to survive. He parried, pivoted, conserved his energy. His mind was not on glory. It was on the girl hidden in the cave, on the healer tending the wounded behind the wagon. He was fighting for their chance, for the promise he had made. A short knife appeared in Marcus's left hand. It was a dirty trick, a move from the back alleys of their youth. As their swords locked, he slashed sideways. The blade bit deep into Tobias's forearm, right below the brand. Pain flared hot and sharp. Blood welled instantly, dark and slick. His grip on his sword faltered for a heartbeat. It was all the opening Marcus needed. He smiled, a cruel twist of his mouth, and raised his sword for a finishing blow. Tobias did not try to regain his footing. He used the momentum of his stumble. He dropped his weight, pivoting on his heel. He swung his own blade in a low, flat arc. It was not an elegant move. It was pure desperation, a farmer scything wheat. The edge caught Marcus across the back of his legs, cutting through tendon and bone. Marcus's cry was cut short as he fell, his body collapsing into the dust. He landed hard, his sword skittering away. He tried to push himself up, but his legs would not obey. He looked up at Tobias, his eyes wide with shock, then with a dawning, final understanding. Tobias stood over him. His arm throbbed, blood dripping from his fingers. He looked down at his brother's face. The hate was gone, replaced by the blank surprise of a man who never considered his own end. Tobias ended it, a single clean thrust. The body went still. The death brought no victory. It was a grim, hollow feeling, a relief that the immediate threat was gone, a burden that would never leave. The weight of another life taken, another piece of his past extinguished. The conflict that had simmered for years, the rivalry, the betrayal, the differing paths, was over. It had not ended with words or reconciliation. It had ended here on a dusty battlefield with steel and blood. It was the final violent answer to the question of their brotherhood. The price of their father's legacy was paid once more, and the coin was the life of his youngest son. Tobias pulled his sword free. The sound it made was the only epitaph Marcus would get. Eleliana broke her promise. The need to see her mother, the screams, the clash of steel, it pulled her from the safety of the cave. She crept to the ridge edge. The scene below was a storm of dust and violence. She saw Tobias. His arm was bleeding, dark blood soaking his sleeve. He was locked in a desperate fight with a warrior. She saw the prisoner wagon. The door was open. People were clustered behind it. And there in the middle of it all was her mother. Serena was kneeling, her hands pressing on a wounded man's shoulder, her face a mask of calm intensity. The sight was a magnet. Eleliana started down the slope, her small form hidden by rocks and chaos. A nomad warrior saw her. He was off to the side, separated from the main fight. He moved fast. An arm wrapped around her middle, lifting her off her feet. Her cry was muffled against leather armor. His grip was iron, crushing the air from her lungs. He held her easily, a small, struggling prize. He wasn't trying to kill her. A live child was a valuable trade item, a future worker. She kicked, she scratched, but it was useless. He began to pull her back toward the pinned-down rear guard. Tobias saw it happen. He was 20 meters away, his sword locked with his brother's. He saw the warrior, saw the small, familiar form caught in his arms. A cold spike of fear drove through him. He tried to shove Marcus back to break free, but the man held fast, a grim smile on his face. He knew he had Tobias trapped. He knew the distraction was a weapon. Every second Tobias was stuck here was a second the warrior gained distance. The gap was too far. He was too engaged. He roared in frustration, a raw sound of pure helplessness. An arrow hissed through the air. It came from the western ridge. It was a clean, straight shot. The steel tip punched through the side of the warrior's neck. He made a wet, choking sound. His grip on Eleliana loosened. He stumbled, his knees buckling. He fell, dragging her down with him for a moment before his arms went slack. Eleliana scrambled free, her clothes stained with his blood. She was shaking, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Lyra lowered her bow. She stood on a rock outcrop, her form a sharp silhouette against the sky. She had seen the capture. She had calculated the angle, the wind, the moving target. Her aim was true. Her intervention was timely, precise, and utterly lethal. It was the only kind of help she knew how to give. She didn't look at Eleliana. Her good eye scanned for the next threat, her expression unchanging. The action was devoid of emotion. It was a simple equation. The child was part of the mission parameters. The threat was removed. Eleliana stood over the dead man, her small body trembling. Her defiance had nearly cost her life. It had pulled a key defender's attention at a critical moment. It could have unraveled everything. But it had also done something else. It had forced Lyra's hand. It had been a test of their brittle, tactical alliance. Lyra could have let the warrior take her. One less liability, one less complication. But she didn't. She had honored the agreement. She had protected the asset. The child's reckless act had nearly destroyed their chance, but it had also, unexpectedly, proven that the alliance held. For now, the pact of mutual need was stronger than their history of hate. The thread holding them together was thin, but it had not snapped. A figure rode out from the mass of milling warriors. He sat tall on a war strider, a beast bred for desert combat. His armor was dark, unadorned except for the spiral sigil etched into the breastplate. Darius. Time had not bent him. His face was all hard plains and cold eyes, a monument to absolute authority. The fighting had stopped. His presence commanded a silence deeper than any threat. The field of his making was now a stage for his judgment. He looked over the dead, the broken wagon, the freed captives. His gaze finally settled on his son. Tobias stood his ground. His sword was down but ready. Blood dripped from his wounded arm, pattering softly on the dust. The air felt charged, thick with a history of violence and disappointment. Father and son faced each other across 20 paces of open ground. The distance felt infinite. Darius's voice cut the silence. It was not a shout. It was a low, cold pronouncement that carried across the canyon. The next time we meet, I will not stay my hand. Blood or no blood. The words were a statement of fact, a promise. They hung in the air, a permanent shadow cast over Tobias's future. It was not a question. It was a line drawn in the sand. The next confrontation would have no quarter. Family would mean nothing. Then the unexpected, a flicker of something that was not mercy but calculation. Darius's eyes swept over the scene once more. He saw the freed Lacostran, the wounded, the determined set of the healer's shoulders as she continued her work. He saw Lyra on the ridge, her bow still in hand. He saw his son standing protectively near the child. He took it all in, a commander assessing a changed battlefield. His decision was swift, delivered with the same cold finality as his threat. Take them and go. He gestured vaguely toward the captives. His voice held no warmth, no forgiveness. It was a transaction. Consider this your inheritance. The words were loaded. They were not a gift. They were a payment. A partial settling of a debt owed from a lifetime of service and a legacy of brutality. It was the only kind of mercy a man like Darius could offer. It was not about compassion. It was about power, control, and a game only he understood the rules to. Tobias felt the pull of the moment. The old rage was there, a hot coal in his chest. The man who ordered a child's death was within reach. The man who branded him, who shaped him into a weapon, was offering a way out. It was a trap, he knew it. Vengeance here would be suicide. It would also sacrifice everyone else. He looked at Serena, her hands still bloody from tending an enemy soldier. He looked at Eleliana, her small face pale but trusting. He even looked at Lyra, a fellow survivor of their father's world. Their presence was an anchor. It pulled him back from the cliff edge of his own anger. He made his choice. He chose protection over revenge. He chose the living over the dead. He gave a single, slow nod. He did not thank his father. There was nothing to thank him for. He simply turned his back, a gesture of defiance and acceptance all at once. The choice was a turning point. It was a rejection of the cycle he was born into. The warlord watched them for a moment longer, Then he turned his strider and rode back toward his disordered troops. His departure was a signal. The nomads began to regroup, to tend their own wounded, to clear the blocked pass. The immediate threat was over. But it was not an end. It was a postponement. The war was not finished. The business between father and son was unresolved. The shadow of that final promise remained, a storm cloud on the horizon. The inheritance was not peace. It was a temporary ceasefire, and the certainty of a harder fight to come. They moved east. The group was a ragged line of freed captives, their steps slow and heavy on the hard ground. The sky was clear now, the blood moon gone. The light felt normal, but the air was still thick with the smell of dust and blood. They were wounded. They were tired. The retreat was a perilous thing. Not all of them would make it. The nomads were behind them, but the distance was not a guarantee. The desert itself was a threat. Dehydration, exposure. The journey was a race against their own weakness. Serena moved among them. Her own captivity had been brief, but her strength was not her own. It was for others. She used torn strips of cloth from her tunic to bind a deep gash on a man's leg. She made a splint for a woman's broken arm using 2 pieces of splintered wagon wood. Her hands were steady, her voice calm. She spoke quiet words of reassurance. Her healing skills were a practical balm, a direct counter to the violence they had just endured. She assessed their condition, prioritized the wounded, and set a sustainable pace. Her presence was a steadying force, a point of calm in the exhausted group. She was their guide now, her knowledge of the land their only map. Eleliana stayed close to Tobias. She matched his limping pace, her small hand sometimes finding his good arm. She did not speak much. Her trust was a quiet, solid thing. She had seen him fight. She had seen him bleed. Her absolute faith was now a fact, a weight he carried with care. He accepted his own wounds. The cut on his arm throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. He did not complain. The pain was a marker, a receipt for the choices made. He looked at the people around him, at the determined set of Serena's shoulders, at the girl walking beside him. His exile felt like a distant memory, a life belonging to another man. That solitary penance was over. This was something new. The 3 women formed an unspoken protective circle around the group's fragile core. Serena led, setting the direction with a healer's quiet authority. Lyra ranged ahead and to the flanks, a silent scout watching for any sign of pursuit, her bow her only companion. Eleliana stayed in the center, a small, watchful presence, her connection to Tobias a tether between the guardian and the guided. It was an alliance born of shared need, a network of strength where before there had only been isolated survival. The land began to change. The harsh red rock gave way to hard-packed earth. The air lost its dry bite, gaining a hint of moisture. A faint green smell reached them on the breeze. They were getting close. The journey was no longer just an escape. It was a path. Each step was a movement away from the isolated cliffs and toward something Tobias had not known in 6 years. A community. A purpose that was not about hiding but about guarding. The Lacostran Lake settlement awaited. It was a potential home for a man who had lived without one. A place where his skills might find a use that did not end in a body on the ground. The retreat was a transition, a slow, painful walk from a past of violence toward a future of protection. The weight of his sword felt different on his hip. It was no longer a tool for a lone survivor. It was a promise to the people walking beside him. The village rose from the lakeshore, a cluster of rounded structures built from hardened clay. Intricate patterns of spirals and lines were etched deep into the walls. Small round windows let slivers of light through. The air smelled of wet earth, cooking smoke, and the clean scent of the water. The sounds were unfamiliar. Voices called to one another. The soft splash of a boat paddle. The distant sound of children laughing. It was a place built for people to live together, something Tobias had not been part of for a very long time. A small crowd gathered to watch them approach. The Lacostran people did not rush forward. They stood and watched. Their faces showed curiosity. They showed caution. Humans were a rare sight here, an unwelcome one most likely. An old man stepped from the group. His skin was a network of fine lines, his eyes a calm, deep brown. This was Elder Morath. His posture was straight, his movements deliberate. He looked at the ragged group of freed captives. He looked at Serena, who gave him a small, tired nod. His gaze finally settled on Tobias. It was a measuring look, sharp and intelligent. He took in the blood on his sleeve, the sword at his hip, the weary set of his shoulders. He saw the brand. He did not flinch. "The council wishes to thank you properly for what you did," the elder said. His voice was low, resonant. The words were formal. They were a recognition of the action, not yet an acceptance of the man. The welcome was a careful thing. It was a chance. It was a door held open a crack. It was not an invitation to come inside and sit by the fire. Not yet. Tobias was the first human to walk among them in years. He was an anomaly, a potential threat, a question mark. The elder's eyes lingered on the weapon. Tobias's skills were written in the cuts on his arms, in the way he held himself, always scanning, always assessing. Those skills were forged for killing. They were made for conquest and fear. But here, in this place of woven homes and children's laughter, they could be something else. They could be a wall, a shield. The elder seemed to be turning this idea over in his mind, weighing the danger of the weapon against the value of a defender. Ileliana stepped forward. She stood beside Tobias, a small, determined figure. "He could belong here," she said, her voice clear. She looked at the elder, then at the watching villagers. "He could teach us. We need a teacher. We need to learn how to stop them from taking us again." Her words were simple. They cut through the tension. She did not see an exile or a weapon. She saw a man who could show them how to protect their homes. Her absolute faith was a stubborn fact in the cautious air. The narrative of his life shifted in that moment. It pivoted on the point of a child's trust. His solitary penance on the cliffside was over. That was a life of looking inward, of punishing himself for crimes of inaction. This was different. This was looking outward. This was about responsibility to others. The skills that had defined him as a destroyer could now define him as a guardian. The brand on his arm no longer felt like a chain to a bloody past. It felt like a lesson, a hard lesson in what not to become. His future was no longer a solitary path of survival. It was potentially tied to the safety of this place, to the people who lived here. The arc of his story turned away from isolation and toward a hesitant, fragile belonging. The purpose was no longer escape. It was protection. Lyra stood apart from the small group gathering by the water. Her pack was already on her shoulders, cinched tight. Her bow was slung across her back. She turned to Tobias, her one good eye holding his. The easy trust of the fight was gone, replaced by the old familiar distance. Her path was different now. It veered away from this tentative peace, back into the harsh landscapes they knew best. She tapped a rolled piece of treated hide sticking out from her belt. The map. It was her prize taken from the convoy commander's body. It was a simple, brutal schematic. A line here, a mark there. Each one pointed to a place where the first colonists had buried their worst toys. It wasn't a guide to power. It was a checklist for demolition. Her goal was not to claim that power. It was to erase it, to find each cache and burn it to the ground. She would not let their father get his hands on those weapons. She would not let any other warlord rise with that kind of strength. Her mission was a form of containment, a necessary scorching of the earth. Her realism was a cold splash of water against the fragile hope of the village. Tobias had found a purpose here, a chance to build a shield. Lyra saw a wider battlefield. She saw the inevitable pull of old weapons, the greed they inspired in every faction. Her solution was not protection, it was elimination. She would break the tools before anyone could use them. It was a lonely, brutal war, and she would fight it alone. She offered him a future, but it was on her terms. "When you're ready, find me," she said. The words were not an invitation. They were a statement of fact. She knew this quiet life by the lake would not hold him forever. The ghosts were too loud. The fight was too ingrained. She was giving him an exit strategy, a path back to the only world they truly understood. The offer was a thread, thin but strong, connecting their separate journeys. Their shared history was a knot that could not be untied. It was a history of violence and betrayal, but also of a shared understanding no one else could ever have. This vow of hers expanded everything. The conflict was no longer a contained family drama. It was no longer just about one warlord and his rebellious children. It became a multi-faction threat. The existence of those caches was a secret that would draw every power-hungry group on Eridan 6. Raiders, settlers, other nomad clans. They would all hunt for that power. Lyra's mission put her in the path of all of them. She was starting a war on a dozen fronts, a silent one-woman campaign against the very idea of absolute power. Her departure ensured the rescue was not an end. It was a single battle won in a much larger ongoing war. The immediate danger to the village was gone, but a greater, more diffuse threat now simmered across the desert. Lyra became a moving part of that larger conflict, a rogue element dedicated to keeping the balance of power shattered. She walked away from the lake without looking back. Her figure grew smaller against the horizon, a single determined shape heading into the vast empty land. The mission continued. The stakes were just higher, and the battlefield was the entire planet. He woke to the sound of voices. A woman called out a greeting. Water lapped against a dock. The air in the small clay dwelling was cool and still. He had slept on a woven mat, a blanket of rough spun wool over him. It was the first sleep he'd had under a roof in 6 years. The branded spiral on his forearm was still there. The skin was raised and pale, a permanent record of loyalty sworn under a hot iron. He ran his fingers over the ridges. It identified him. It named him the son of Warlord Darius. The blood of the Iron Nomads was a current that would always run in his veins. That fact was unchangeable, but blood was not a command. It was not destiny. The mark was not his soul. It was a reminder, a lesson carved into his flesh. It was a map of the path he had refused to take. He had rejected his father's violence. He had walked away from that legacy of domination. The brand was a record of the past, not a chain to it. It could serve as a warning of what he must never become again. The shame he carried was a weight he could choose to set down. It was a choice. His skills were still his. The precise draw of the bow, the clean parry of the sword, the silent tread across difficult ground. They were the same skills that had built his father's empire of fear. But here, in this village of spirals and quiet voices, they could have a different purpose. They were not for conquest. They could be for defense. He could teach others what he knew. He could show them how to read a distant dust cloud, how to spot an ambush point, how to make a clean kill only when there was no other choice. His knowledge, forged in cruelty, could be used to prevent it. Eleliana's faith in him was a quiet force. She looked at him and did not see the warlord's heir. She saw the man who had carried her up a rock face, the man who had fought for her mother. Her absolute trust became a mirror. It reflected back an image of a man he had not dared to believe he could become. A protector, a teacher, a guardian. Her simple, stubborn belief made the image feel possible, solid. For the first time in 6 years, he felt something other than the grim satisfaction of survival or the cold ache of guilt. It was a faint, unfamiliar warmth in his chest. It felt like hope. It was the possibility of a life that was not defined by what he had escaped, but by what he could build. It was the chance to belong to something, to be needed by people who saw his value not in his capacity for violence, but in his ability to prevent it. The symbol of shame was transforming. It was no longer just a brand of a son who failed his father. It was becoming a mark of a man who had chosen a different path. It could be a symbol of protection, a reminder that strength could be a shield. His future was no longer a solitary road leading away from his past. It was now tethered to the needs of a community, to the safety of a healer and her daughter, to the people who had offered him a cautious welcome. His purpose was no longer a command from a warlord. It was an answer to a call from a child. It was a choice he made every morning, looking at the mark on his arm and deciding what it would mean that day. He got up from the mat. He stepped outside into the morning light. The village was awake. People moved with purpose. They nodded to him. It was not a full acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. He looked at his hands. They were the same hands. They could do different work. The future was an uncertain thing, but for the first time it was a thing he wanted to see. His choice to answer a child's plea rewrote a legacy written in violence. It became a promise of protection, a new purpose forged in the desert heat. The skills born from cruelty were turned to defense. The exile ended not by forgetting the past, but by using its harsh lessons to guard a fragile future. Redemption was not found alone in the silence of his cave. It was earned in the courage to move, however reluctant, toward the sound of someone else's need. It was a choice to stand between danger and the defenseless,